And then you poop your pants.
And we're starting, so we've started.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. Go! Go! Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Continuous Discussions, an open forum for folks to talk about Agile, DevOps, and continuous delivery. I'm Sam Fell.
And I'm Anders Walgren. And we have a distinguished set of panelists today.
We are talking to four fine fellows from all over the world. We have Dave Mango. Dave, can you introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Dave Mango. I'm the Director of Operations at Librato, which is a metrics and monitoring company, and happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you. Where are you located today, Dave?
Beautiful, sunny, but chilly downtown San Francisco.
Oh, it's not raining anymore? It was raining there earlier when I left.
Raining this morning, but it's kind of pretty blue skies right now.
Fantastic. All right. But I was happy to get the rain. We got some good rain last night, which was nice. Dimitris, Papathomopoulos, welcome to the program.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi from New York. As you said, my name is Dimitris Papathomopoulos, and I work as a Director of Technology for Software Solutions, and lately Cloud Solutions for InfoTech. And I'm managing various projects for a diverse array of technologies, and lately I'm very much involved in the development and the growing of the ecosystem of our RPAS Cloud, the research publishing and automation delivery system that caters to Wall Street kind of firms and institutions. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion.
Great, welcome, thank you. We also have Uri Cohen. Uri, welcome.
Hey, thank you. So my name is Uri Cohen. I'm with Gigaspaces. Amongst other things, we build an open source automation platform for deploying in various cloud environments. I'm based out of Israel right now, a little bit to the north of Tel Aviv. I'm actually home. It's evening here, and the weather is fine. It's it's about the high 20s Celsius centigrade, 70s, 80s. So it's kind of nice.
It is nice. Now, I was hearing a bit of welcome. I was hearing a bit of a dropout in the middle of your speech. Did anyone else hear that, or is that my end?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Yuri, I think maybe you might have a poor connection. So we'll want to make sure that we're trying to monitor that a little bit. But welcome.
Thank you.
Connection at all? It's got to come all the way from Israel, so I understand. And then last but not least, we have Yuval. Yuval, introduce yourself.
Hi, Yuval. I'm the CTO and an enterprise Agile coach at Agile Sparks out of Israel. Probably pretty close to Uri at the moment, if I understand the location correctly. And I basically help enterprises as well as smaller companies become more agile. And recently that includes thinking about DevOps and end-to-end flow and optimizing not just what happens within dev and test, but also looking elsewhere. And I've seen my share of legacy environments where people try to do these kind of things. So looking forward to an interesting discussion about it today.
That is a fantastic setup. Thank you, Yuval. So today, folks, we're talking about DevOps and Lean in legacy environments. As much as we would all like, we cannot all work for unicorns. And so when you're getting to DevOps for a single product team and a unicorn thing, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. But how do you inject the ideas of DevOps and Lean into companies where you have legacy product running on COBOL? See, I told you I would be able to mention COBOL. COBOL or IMS, you've got mainframe technology, you've got distributed server computing. These are spread out across multiple continents with multiple different technology stacks. How do you possibly coordinate all that and get these folks working together in a DevOps or a Lean manner? And that is our topic for discussion today. And I have like 1,000 different versions of these, which is awesome, and I appreciate that. I do. It's super, super good. And so now I'm going to find the first one. So this is for Juan, who's listening in on Twitter, and I expect that he will probably say something if you're following along on the hashtag C9D9. I'm going to go through the first round of questions here. I'm going to start with Dave, and I'm going to ask, moving to Agile DevOps from Waterfall ITIL, what are some of the things that you need to sort of be aware of, and how do you talk to teams, and how do you get teams spooled up to make that move from Waterfall or ITIL to Agile and DevOps? Dave, what are your thoughts?
I think really you have to identify there's a problem that you're trying to solve, right? A lot of times I've talked to people about, like, should we do DevOps? Should we do this? Should we do that? And I'm like, well, are you having problems? You know, are you able to release your software on time? Are you, having production outages when you do it? Like, are you able to deliver on stuff when you say you're going to deliver on it? If there's no problem to solve there, then there's no reason to move away from Waterfall ITIL. It's not like DevOps and Agile are, cure-alls for anything. But I think once you've identified, there are things that you'd like to do better, then it's sort of, if you go to, Humble and Farley's continuous delivery idea of running to the pain, right? You need to identify what parts of your delivery pipeline or your operational infrastructure or things like that are the ones that are having the most pain, and you run to that pain and try to solve it. And I think that's where you can start to bring in these lean principles, these DevOps kinds of principles, because they're solving real-world problems that people are having, as long as you can identify what those things are.
Yep, that's an excellent point. Don't try and solve a non-problem, basically.
Solution looking for a problem?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So have you worked with companies, though, that have tried to make that transition from Waterfall ITIL to Agile, and what were some of the experiences that you sort of helped them through?
So I was an architect at Salesforce for a number of years before I started here at Librado 2 months ago. And it was interesting because they were actually making a transformation from sort of ITIL Agile instead of ITIL Waterfall. And they had a lot of Agile practices that wasn't 100% across the board, but there was pretty mature implementation for a lot of Agile. Certainly, I mean, like Yuval, they had amazing Agile coaches there who were really very helpful in teaching people about stuff. But yeah, going through that, I mean, there was a lot of legacy process, right? That ITIL has a lot of really good aspects to it. Like, there was a lot of this change management board and change control and all these kinds of things, which really slowed down a lot of the way that work was delivered. So one of the things that we were able to do, and we talked about this last year at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, was make it so that any change that went through configuration management and had unit tests and functional tests and things like that would be considered a quote-unquote standard change. And those standard changes then you could actually release without anywhere near the level of, let's call it, red tape that you would have had to otherwise. Because when you're writing infrastructure as code, which is a pretty core DevOps principle, you can actually prove that the code is going to be safe to run in production. Maybe not 100% prove it, but a lot more than hey, I wrote down this run list of how I'm supposed to get stuff done, and as long as I got all the commands correct and everyone who reviewed it was really intent on reviewing it and gave it their all, and we did all this stuff, we have, gosh darn it, a really good idea that it'll probably work in production. It's a lot better if you can be here's my unit test, here's the virtual machines I spun up, the Puppet code or the Chef code or whatever made the changes that I said it was going to make. And so we kind of just looked at things like that, things that were challenges to delivery, and then trying to attack those in ways that made sense to be able to kind of get more lean and optimize the
pipeline. Is anyone else hearing echo?
Yes, I'm hearing echo.
Yeah, so I've muted my phone, my computer here. as soon as I let go of my keyboard, I will be muted. Let's see. Dimitris, can you try muting your computer? And let's see if that fixes it. That absolutely fixes it. All right, so I'll ask you all to stay muted unless you're speaking. Dave, impressive job of speaking through your own voice. I love to listen to myself, but not about 3 milliseconds after I've said something, because then it's really confusing. So that is very interesting. I appreciate you sharing that with us. It is an interesting sort of set of points that you bring up. And so I'm going to move on now to next person on the list. So Dimitris, I just asked you to mute yourself. I'm going to have to ask you now to unmute yourself. Give me your thoughts on helping companies move from Agile and from Waterfall ITIL to Agile and DevOps. Your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, first, it's true what David said, that first you need to identify and specify why you want to do that. I mean, obviously, and by definition, if there is a legacy system, that means that has been running for years, and that alone means that the system is successful. So you need to think, okay, why I want to change things, and why I want to do certain things, and also how am I going to do them, and how am I going to justify, obviously, the cost of that change. I think it's important to understand that when in DevOps, there are some misconceptions, I believe, that as long as, for example, you have a team of developments that they know how to program in Chef or Puppet, that's all you need to do, and you are DevOps. However, that's not DevOps. According to the Agile manifesto that I believe we all need to follow, it's very important that when you do something like automation of certain things within a system, you need to communicate very well with all the stakeholders. You need to communicate with your management, you need to communicate with your marketing department, the business developers, your own developers, and as well the customer and your end user. So from that discussion, you need to decide what it is that you want to do and why you have to do it. You need to justify, okay, what is the cost of optimizing certain things, the immediate cost, and what is the long-term investment. So going back to your question on a legacy system which has proved itself, it is successful if it runs for such a long time and provides value to its end users, there are always some areas that you need to optimize. And let me give you a very quick example that I also think is very appealing. Typically, a legacy system does not have a way to, doesn't provide an automatic way to provide updates and new features to its end users. A typical, from my experience at least, and I've been doing this for almost 20 years, from my experience, every release requires at least 4 people. It requires 2 developers, it requires a DBA, it requires a project manager, and perhaps other people. If a typical release takes about 4 hours, that means you spend for every release 16 hours of manpower. And I can say for every hour, if you pay, for example, these people $100 an hour, that equates to $1,600 for every release. If you are lucky enough to have 1 release a month, that equates to almost $20,000 a year for 1 single project.
Right.
And if you have to do that for 4 or 5 or maybe more projects. In a big corporation, the release might be 100 projects. So multiply $20,000 a year by the number of projects that you actually have to manage and release. So immediately you understand that the cost of a manual release can be way too high. And that's something that you need to look at.
Yeah.
All of us need to look at. Spending a certain amount of time on system releases that perhaps happen during the weekend, it's time that is spent that does not give absolutely zero value to the end users. The end users pay you for the time that they spend to use your software, not for the time that you spend to actually release updates and features. They're not exposed to that, and at the end of the day, they don't really care.
That's right.
So I think it makes absolute sense, not for only a legacy system, but for every system. But since we're talking about legacy systems, let's focus on that. It makes absolute sense to everyone through the entire hierarchy in your organization to look at how you must automate your releases. Not because you're going to save immediately a certain amount of money, but also you're going to be able to utilize that time and those resources to create on other projects that will produce more value.
Right, absolutely.
Value
things.
is measured,
100%.
value is measured, again, as I said before, by the time your end users spending using your software, not anywhere else. So I think that's a very, very, very simple. It's a simple arithmetic. It's a very compelling reason to introduce automation in legacy environments and make the effort to do it. Yes, granted, there is a cost to it. There's going to be a cost. And your managers and your stakeholders will ask you, okay, that's fine, but how much this is going to cost me to do it first, and what is the long-term investment out of it?
Right, absolutely. Dimitris, that's fantastic. I want to make sure that we have a chance for other folks to comment.
Okay, so I'll leave it at that. So
yeah, that's good, but that's absolutely, you made some really, really good points there. So I want to move on now to Uri. Uri, what are your thoughts on this? And one of the things that I was thinking that we would sort of touch on and that folks really haven't talked about is timing for releases. And if you have a team that's more of a DevOps sort of a team, and they need to release, Dimitris just talked a lot about releases and how much money they cost, keeping those releases sort of in sync. If you've got legacy systems and you've got newer systems that need to integrate with it, as probably most of us do, how do you keep those things in sync? How do you make sure that the COBOL group or that the legacy group is going to be able to keep up with the pace of releases that you're doing? How do you sync those trains up? Uri, what are your thoughts?
So I know it mainly from the enterprise perspective, right? So it's not really about a single organization trying to drive one or two products out to production. It's really about an entire organization that has, I don't know, 5,000, 10,000 applications, whether they're facing upwards or inwards into the organization, and trying to optimize that. I guess, as you mentioned, like there are so many barriers there, starting from just plain resources and provisioning. How do I get the resources I need from an application? The variety of applications. So you can have COBOL applications side by side with Rails and Node applications, and it's really very different animals. And then as you try to push changes, a lot of those organizations have barriers like regulatory limitations, or you have to go through a specific process or specific systems or specific people before you even can push something to production. Then there's always the organizational structure, right? So some groups within the organizations really try to justify their purpose in a sense, and kind of try to enforce all those limitations. Rightfully on their end, right? So if it's security or compliance, these things are important to all companies. And also tooling, right? So a lot of people kind of say DevOps is not about tooling, it's about the culture, but it's also about the tooling. because if you're not on a virtualized platform, it's really hard to do self-service. If you have, let's say, monolithic or non-open source technologies to do your pipeline, it's really hard to implement configuration, code as configuration in code, or basically do source control on your processes, because these products just don't work this way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of barriers there, and the way I found things to work, at least in the organizations that I've seen, is one of two. The first one is a lot of people talk about black IT, right? About specific groups within an organization kind of going under IT or on top of IT, depends how you want to look at it, and just go to Amazon or things like that without anyone noticing that. And it's usually considered a bad thing, but really what it is, it's I at least see it in some respect very positive. Because on one hand, it allows them to innovate and do things faster and not wait on people, and on the other hand, it creates kind of a competition for the internal IT organization, and they kind of realize what you can do if you do work in a more modern way of working with cloud, with automation and these kinds of things.
Shadow IT is onto something, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then the other bit is sometimes, the way I see things working is that the IT organization identifies a very specific use case, typically very small, non-mission critical, and start there and try to optimize the process there. So all of the experimentation, all of the new tooling, so if they install a private cloud or they start using tools like Chef or Puppet or Docker, it starts there because they don't want to experiment with the real business critical stuff. And then if that succeeds, everyone else in the organization start to look around and say, well, how did that happen? We want some of that as well. And then kind of the ball starts rolling on its own.
Right. It's a pull, not a push, which is the best way of doing it. I want to interrupt you. One of the things that does our enterprise summit for DevOps and Lean that we do with Team Kim every year, it's coming up again in October. If you'd like to join, you can go to DevOpsEnterprise.io and you can check that out. We'd love to have you and continue this discussion there. But last year, Cameron Haight from Gartner was talking about the two different types of systems that you have. I don't know if you remember this or not, but he talks about systems of innovation, which is prime candidates for DevOps and Agile type thinking, and systems of governance. And so the center of your ERP system, the database that kind of binds everything together. And those things you may not want to try and change every day. You may not want to have that
right.
Innovation be quite as high there because the risks are so much higher. But around the periphery, as long as you've defined the interface to that core system in a very safe way, then you can innovate as much as you want and not worry about sort of damaging the goods at the heart of it. And so I think your comments sort of lined up with that. And if you think about it, that's great. Awesome, Yuri. Thank you. So I'm going to move over now to Yuval. Yuval, what are your thoughts on moving to Agile or DevOps from a waterfall or an ITIL sort of perspective? You are muted.
So, first of all, you keep mentioning COBOL and mainframe and those environments. And you remind me, it was, I think, 22 years back, something like that. And we were working with mainframe in some, mission-critical places in the Israeli army somewhere. And we were doing DevOps there. We were deploying every week. The developers and operations were talking to each other. So something has happened in those 20 years. And I think just now we are starting to get back to those days. I think actually the COBOL guys back there knew how to do DevOps. It's not the technology that it is the issue. Right. We didn't really know about waterfall until we started to do client-server projects, so it was pretty interesting. But coming back to these days, what I see with most clients is that the urge to go to DevOps and Agile, at least for those systems of innovation, is there. People really want to do it. They're just not sure how exactly to go about doing it. I mean, culture is not a thing you can implement on one hand, and tools is something that you can implement, but it's not clear what kind of tools would be the first ones to invest in. So my approach there is to look at things from a flow perspective, get people to look at their end-to-end process or value streams from need all the way to production, and start to see where things get stuck, where are the big batch sizes, where are the late feedbacks. Start to visualize your system, use a Kanban, use some visual flow diagram, do whatever you want. But it will start to give you a picture of what is going on in your system and what are the bottlenecks and what to deal with.
Yep.
And then when you have those bottlenecks or big batch sizes that you become aware of, one of the things that that I talk about and people really like to think about is this this combination of different types of costs that I learned from Don Runnertz, and he talks about the fact that everybody is currently optimizing for lower overheads, for lower transaction costs. Dimitris talked about the cost of releasing. Yes, obviously people try to release less often, so because it reduces the overheads of releasing. On the other end, what people are typically not aware of is the cost of the delayed feedback or the cost of missing the time to market.
Right.
And only when people start to combine those two things and get the full picture, they understand that, wow, maybe this tool that can help us reduce the transaction costs and help us release more often does have an ROI. It provides us the return. The return on it is that we can actually get earlier feedback whether we have problems in production, yes or no, or whether this innovative idea, innovative feature that we're working on is in the right direction or not.
Right.
And
higher quality.
it can help us save some time later on.
Yeah.
It's kind of trivial when you go to small companies to do all of this technology stack and all of this process stack in, one time, fix everything, and they really get it. But when you look at really big companies, one example is a company that worked on their continuous integration for 2 years now, investing millions of dollars, getting from a monolith build system that takes days across multiple applications, including your COBOL. And now they're close to continuous integration for some fixed configurations. They're still working on it. Getting there to continuous deployment or just automating the deployment pipeline is going to take a lot of time. They need a lot of clear ROI for it in order to sustain the journey.
That's I don't know what time it is. What time are we at? So, wow, we're halfway through the program. We're only on one question. So a lot of great conversation on this topic. I think it warrants more than one session. But I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you as well. I'm going to pass it off to Anders to see what his thoughts are on Agile DevOps and Waterfall IDLE. Have we heard anything from Juan on the Twitter stream, guys? Is there anything? Okay, all right.
I'll jump in. So I was taking a bunch of notes. I think one of the interesting things I heard from Dave was, what problem are we fixing? And I think the thing you want to be careful about there is the being, the guy who jumps off the building and halfway down says, well, so far so good. I think a lot of times the impetus for this kind of change is coming from outside the company, not inside the company. You're being disrupted by five guys or gals in a garage, and you don't want to be Blockbuster to Netflix or Netflix to Redbox. I don't want to imply that that's what you were saying, but that thought just sort of occurred to me as you were saying that. And then I think I heard sort of two interesting things. One of which is technology isn't the problem. And I think that's absolutely true. I think, process and culture are the difficult parts to get around to. And then I heard the flip side of that too, which sort of, technology is the problem, and especially around if you don't do virtualization, then you're going to have a very difficult time doing, process as code and those kinds of things. And I think I'd probably go a little bit more with a former, which is I think technology isn't the problem. I think you can do a lot of DevOps, a lot of Agile, a lot of non-waterfall type stuff, even without virtualization. It definitely helps. There's no question. But I wouldn't go trying to virtualize your mainframe, although they probably already do virtualization on mainframes, but that's a different story. But again, I think it's not the tools. I think you want to be looking at the processes and the people and the culture around what you're doing, and treat those as the difficult problems to solve. And then I think one of the best things I heard so far was look at the flow, look at the business process that you're trying to solve, figure out where your big batch sizes are, figure out where the bottlenecks are, and solve those. That's really the point of the whole thing, right? I mean, you're not doing Agile for the sake of Agile. You're not doing DevOps for the sake of DevOps. You're doing that to smooth out a particular process flow and get innovation out from the engineering side to the customer side. So I think there's just a ton of really good comments so far.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very rich topic. And so the next question that we were going to talk about was, how have you defined success, right? And I think we sort of covered that topic a little bit in this current question. So I'm going to forego that one because we don't have time and move on to the next one, which I think will get a little bit more interesting when we start talking about the answers, is in these environments where you do have these systems of record and you do have these systems of innovation, how do you encourage experimentation? Right, as part of that flow, you're bringing up a lot of great points around recognizing where problem exists, understanding what tooling you're using, giving teams the opportunity to play with different tools. How do you promote that experimentation and make sure that you're gathering that feedback and using it towards some good end? And I'm going to start backwards, and I'm going to have Yuval start us off this time. Yuval.
Yeah. So just an example. Oh, there's an echo.
We can hear you fine.
I can hear you good. I'm going to mute myself as well.
Okay. So deal with it. So one example from our clients is that they did two things basically in order to nurture experimentation. One is to use the language of experimentation whenever they talk about things. Start talking about experiment and MVPs, whenever, not just at the product area. And top managers there, senior VPs, started to ask their directors and their people, what's the experiment here? Can we try to experiment with something? That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that when they created the dashboard of how each startup, they call the different business unit startups within the organization, which is another thing that nurtures the thinking of entrepreneurship. And we're talking about, a household enterprise that you've all probably driven in trains produced by those people. Each of those startups has a dashboard that they report to the division leads, okay? And in that dashboard, the thing that they measure in order to show agility is two things. One is basically the rate of experimentation. When they look at the throughput, they talk about not just velocity of output, velocity of experiments, velocity of MVPs or MMFs or whatever it is, those minimum viable products that they get out there. No matter the size, they can try as small an experiment as they want. Just the number of experiments that they try is something that management asks about and talks about. Another thing that they talk about is not the product experimentation, but the process experimentation, which is important as well. Because the important thing for us is to understand that the way we work is also something that is uncertain. We don't know for sure how to work. So let's make sure that we experiment with how we work as well in our retrospectives, Kaizen events, whatever. Try to do something else. Each of those things is something that management is interested to hear that there's an experimentation going on.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent. Sorry, I'm trying to manage my muting at the same time. So that's great. So yeah, so that experimentation, it's an interesting concept that part of those metrics, key metrics, is to look at that velocity of experimentation. That's an interesting thing to be able to measure. So thank you for that. So I'm going to move back now to Uri. And Uri, what are your thoughts on sort of how do you promote and encourage experimentation within teams? Obviously, making it a managed mandate, something that you report up on, will help. How do you think? What do you think about it?
Yeah, so I see like if you can mute yourself. Sorry. All right, great. So I guess two things kind of stifle that. The first one is fear of being wrong is something that stifles many organizations in that respect. So you have to remove that. And in large corporations, enterprise, this is really hard because there are a lot of politics around things, and for every success, there are 1,000 failures that other people build themselves upon. So the first thing is to remove that fear by fostering things like postmortems and techniques like 5 whys and things like that basically allow people to analyze what happened in a more convenient environment and not be afraid of admitting their own errors. So that's one thing. That's a really hard thing to do, and it requires a lot of leadership and a lot of, I would say, guidance from above. It's not something that would kind of grow from the bottom. It's something that the managers need to foster. The other thing is, I would say, more of a data-driven conversation. So for every decision around the product, around the process, try to make it more data-driven, so that it actually forces you to collect the data through experimentation, through measurement, which kind of goes hand in hand. And if you try to make the conversation around that, then experimentation and measurement would kind of happen on their own, because people would have to bring the data to validate their claims and to push whatever they believe in.
There we go. Very good. Okay. So I'm gonna have to figure out maybe like a USB microphone or something for next time, because this is not manageable. All right. Excellent. Yeah, that's another set of very, very good points. Thank you for that. So let's pass it off now to Dimitris. Dimitris, what are your thoughts? How do you help your customers manage this? Wow, really bad.
Okay. Well, I think the desire for experimentation, the desire for innovation, I believe for all of us that we are in technology is something that we have by nature, and so I think that's on an individual basis is easy to foster that and capitalize on that, because development groups and technology groups are prone to always experiment and look for new things. Now, if you are in an environment with, in a legacy environment where things work a little different, where there are more processes and there are governance rules and compliance rules and various IT rules, etc., etc. Well, this is something that you need to start slow, and you need to start small. So you cannot really start a big bang project of innovation and experimentation and DevOps and Agile. You need to take small steps and try to implement those. You need to find the people that will be excited about learning new technologies and that will be excited to try new things. We always, in our jobs, need to think okay, what I did a few years ago and it was great, and whatever technique I used to create a certain data store and a certain and optimize my queries and create a better application, is this applicable now? Well, it might be not. There are new ways right now to store information using NoSQL databases or using in-memory data stores. There are many ways to disseminate information using different APIs and different versions of APIs and different structures behind those APIs. So you need to always start thinking about new and innovative ways to do the same thing as you did before. And you always need to think, before you do everything else, you always need to think, what is, if I try something now and it is innovative and it is experimental, what is the value that I'm going to deliver to my customer, and how I will make it obvious that there is value there. So I always, at least to my developers here, I always talk about the culture of delivery, the culture of delivering features as opposed to just developing features, and the culture of, okay, once a feature is in production, do we know if it's successful or not? That it reduces the idea and the need for us to add to our applications, we decided that we didn't do before, metrics about that give us an idea if a system was a new feature was successful or not. So you need to start innovation and experimentation from yourself and from your own group and the group of people that work with you every single day. So, and every time you define something innovative, you want to explore a certain technology or a certain paradigm in software development, you always need to associate to that what is the business value that is going to deliver. So, as everybody said in this discussion, it's always the change of culture that fosters all these things, not necessarily the tools. It's great. It's amazing to know that we have knowledge of certain technologies and certain tools. It's great that we have people that can be excited and have a desire to use and learn those tools, but at the end of the day, and it needs to start from your own team, your very own developers need to be able to understand and express themselves and make it clear that if we do that, what is the value that we're going to deliver to our customers. So
what's going to be delivered, right? Exactly.
Right. So as long as all these things are clear and well understood, then I think the innovation and the experimentation makes absolute sense and is supported by other groups within your organization. So that's my take on it in terms of.
Excellent. All right, very good. Dimitris, thank you very much. Dave, Mango, what are your thoughts on experimentation?
I think you got to learn the keyboard shortcut for mute to save yourself some trouble on the Hangouts. On the Mac, it's Command D. It'll save your life.
Are you serious? It's a built-in command?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Goes way faster. Anyways, so I think, I mean, a lot of people made some really good points. I really love what you've all said about the language being really important. I know Damon Edwards makes a big deal about this, and I kind of this has sort of been a pet peeve of mine for a long time, is people thinking that the minimum viable product means the crappiest piece of garbage that I can throw out there that barely functions. And that's what the minimum viable product is. And I've heard people just misuse that about 1 billion times in all kinds of environments. And so I know that Damon likes to say it really should be called a minimum viable experiment. And I think that's like a much more accurate thing. So I think the language is really important there, so that people understand. I think Uri was saying that you gotta you have to collect data so that you know if your experiment is successful. Like without that, you're pretty much just throwing out code and like saying, well, we got out the minimum viable product, which that doesn't mean anything really. I think the other thing that's important about the language is, and I think I heard some people kind of alluding to some of this, was that, I've heard a lot of people talk about, well, we should just redefine DevOps as just continuous delivery. And like DevOps is just all about the flow through the organization. And I think that misses out on a whole part of DevOps, which is actually like deeply related to experimentation, which is like the whole game days and things like that we do that, Google's famous for and things like that. Like where, Netflix has continuous game days, right? Because they have the Chaos Monkey running around. And the Chaos Monkey doesn't ensure that we're able to deliver our software faster. It doesn't look for bottlenecks in the delivery and make sure that when our systems are operating in production, they're actually operating, and they're resilient to failure and, Taleb's anti-fragile and all the other kind of associated stuff. But like, I think encouraging, for me, I look at like a game day as experimentation, like straight up. Like I'm experimenting with failure modes and seeing like what's happening there, and that's a different kind of failure or a different kind of experimentation than just simply delivery. Like that's got its own components to it. And while I didn't agree with Uri about virtualization being necessary for like doing DevOps necessarily, just because like Facebook doesn't really do virtualization on their servers, and I've run thousands of servers that we called with the same API that we did to call the virtual servers. They just spun up physical hardware or whatever. I think that the experimentation aspect of it, I think the virtualization, like Anders was saying, really, really helps there. So
it's interesting when you talk about using the same commands to call the virtualized infrastructure as you would a physical infrastructure, and basically what you're saying there is you're treating those two pieces of things, you're abstracting away the fact that one's physical and one's virtual. So I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was literally like a flag. Like, if I say virtual, I want you to spin up some virtual stuff. If not, go find me the appropriate hardware, power it on, build it, configure it, put it behind the load balancer, whatever. But so one of the things that we did actually at Salesforce was we built this environment called Puppet in a Box, which was supposed to be our development environment for Puppet. But it turns out in the end it actually solved kind of a problem that I've seen with experimentation across multiple different companies, not just Salesforce, which is like, we're going to deploy our stack, and our stack has, Tomcat and Oracle or whatever, blah, blah, blah. So what happens is like all the developers figure out how to install that on their desktops, right? And then now, like, even though we're running Red Hat in production, now I've got my Windows machine running Tomcat, which is great, except for the fact that unless we're going to put your machine in production, then you're not really working in a representative environment. So one of the nice things was that people could actually spin up virtual environments that were built with the same code that we build the production code with, and that really encourages like this whole idea of experimentation, because now I can spin up 3 Zookeeper nodes and kill 1 or 2 of them, sort of like a game day scenario. How does my application behave? Do I have like my timeouts set correctly? Do I have this? Do I have that? And I think like those things are really important. So like kind of getting back to what I was saying in the beginning, it's really just like we have to have the right language about it, but we also have to make sure that we're not getting too narrow a focus, right? It's not just about continuous delivery. There's all kinds of opportunity for experimentation across the entire, and I'll say not just even the technology stack, right? I think DevOps extends way out into sales and marketing and other parts of the company, and so it's that opportunity for experimentation. And obviously the marketing people probably know experimentation better than any of us, right? They're like, we're going to try 6 different ad campaigns on Twitter or whatever and see which one gets the most response. So
exactly.
That's totally native to their kind of way of thinking.
I love it. Yeah, that's great. Good points. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. Anders, what are your points? I'm going to hold down this command. I actually use something called push to talk on my Mac. I didn't realize there was a command D, but I will now know that there's command D.
So you're pushing so I can talk?
I am pushing so you can talk.
So I think I don't think I disagree with anyone. I think the probably the first question I would have asked is not how do you encourage experimentation, but how do you stop discouraging experimentation? And I think that's a little bit about what we've all been talking about, which is, language is important. Getting rid of fear of failure is important. If you're Edison and you're inventing the light bulb, you failed, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of times.
What a loser.
What a loser, right? I mean, that guy never would have made it anywhere. So I think, the language and getting rid of the fear and getting rid of the people that operate on the fear, I think is also kind of important in the culture. And I think one of the things that a lot of companies have done is, especially the ones that are not necessarily, tremendously agile or DevOpsy, is do things like hackathons and sit down and actually encourage people to build stuff that's, not necessarily for tomorrow, not necessarily something that's, on the roadmap or even in the backlog.
Yeah.
And the idea is to just start letting people's creative juices flow and give them a safe sandbox in which to fail. And it's amazing, sort of all the creativity and the innovation that you get out of those. I know I preach to the choir when we talk about those. And then one last thing I wanted to just sort of echo on this whole notion of most viable product and how it doesn't mean just throw a bunch of crap out. I think what people forget all the time is that middle word, viable. It has to work. It has to be viable for someone. And I think what a lot of people do is just skip that and think, minimal product, and they forget the viable part. It's got to be able to breathe on its own.
Yeah.
In the environment. So that's all I got.
Excellent. That's already a lot. This is the second time in a row where he's come in and said, "Hey, you asked the question wrong," and so luckily I'm not afraid of failure, which is good because I do it all the time. Just ask anyone in my family. Last question, and we don't have a ton of time. We got 9 minutes, so I'm going to ask each of you to keep it to 2 minutes each. What's different now about production pipelines when you're dealing with legacy environments? And I'm going to randomly select people, and let's start with Yuval.
Well, to tell you the truth, my production pipeline is writing things, so it's not deploying code, but let's talk about customers. It varies. I mean, we do see some people who simply have an automated production pipeline end-to-end with nothing that they do between the point of developer checking in the code and the code getting to production, but that's the minority. Other people, the more typical case would be continuous integration, including some deployment to a test server and running those tests. Some more advanced people get it all the way to deployment on the staging server, enabling fast and easy test by the operations people, and then they get to push the button to get the deployment running. Some more advanced people get some canary testing capabilities on top of it to deploy to just, some servers, run some experiments, things like that. I would say those are 20% of the people we're working with these days, not more than that.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Yuval. So we'll go back to, let's go to Dave. And Dave, what's different about production pipelines when you're dealing with legacy, with sort of mixed environments? What has to be different about them?
Well, I think the problem is it's the legacy part, right? So one of my favorite blog posts ever is Alex Honor's blog post about flow and how handoffs are the killer. And really, when you're in these big legacy environments, like that's the way that those pipelines were designed, right? It's all about the handoffs. Like I want to build a machine, a machine is handed off from the people in the data center to the network engineers, to the sysadmins, to the network engineers, back to the storage guys, over and those handoffs are just basically part of the way that the overall system was designed. So
it's the
you're trying to-
specialization, right? It's the industrialization of computing creation.
Yeah, there's a lot of like neo-Taylorism in there, and so I think that that's the big challenge to your production pipeline in a legacy environment. Is like, how do we change these processes so that we can actually achieve like some degree of flow and everything isn't based on these handoffs, which the handoffs are the killer. So I know one of the things that we did at a previous company was like, I think it was the sysadmins created the forward records and the network engineers created the reverse records. And like that was like part of the coordination process of how things got like handed off or whatever. And so we just made it as like, hey, you're going to make an API call and it's going to make both records. And then have to like
nice,
save all this time, and I think that's like the big challenge in the legacy environments is they weren't designed for flow. They were designed, like you were saying, to protect like sort of functional areas, and that's where the challenge comes in the production pipelines.
Absolutely, great. Thank you for those closing comments. That's wonderful. So Yuri, what are your thoughts on this? Let's skip to you.
Yeah, so one obvious thing is, like Dave said, is reducing the amount of handoffs, which is extremely important. I totally agree about that. The other thing I'm seeing is I'd say more and more automation getting into the pipeline, and that in turn allows to automate a lot of the stuff that used to be manual in the past. So doing testing, UI testing, for example, a lot of things today that didn't exist like 10 years ago allow you to test a certain user interface in a much more robust way than before and make it automatic. Setting up whole new environments, I've seen it many times. So people, as part of their integration testing, basically set up complete environments, bring them up, run a couple of tests, take them down. Again, if you have API-driven IT, which is I would say it's a better definition than virtualization, which I mentioned before. If you have an API-driven IT environment, that's a very good thing to do. And the last thing is around, I would say, application architecture itself, right? So the whole trend of breaking up the monolithic application to microservices and delivering them separately and individually, which makes things a lot simpler to roll out.
Yeah, especially if you're able to take advantage of a lot of the, I'm not sure if it was you or somebody else who mentioned you're sort of working on the failures of others. You're also working on the successes of others. And if you can use an image that someone else has created, that everyone else is using, that someone else manually updates and then distributes out to everybody, then you can focus on your little value added, and you can have if you're using Docker, you can focus on your microservice and not have to worry about all the infrastructure and all the OS stuff and all the garbage that you're building on top of, right? Which is great. So that's great points. Thank you for that.
Definitely.
Dimitris, what are your thoughts on how your production pipelines change when you're mixing legacy and newer technologies?
Okay, I can pick for this just one system that I worked recently that is a legacy system. It's been running for quite a long time, and what we did, we looked at all the various areas and components of the system and categorized those that are good and successful, and on the other side we put those that perhaps are not so good or so not relevant anymore, and we did create a delivery pipeline. Perhaps it's not the traditional or the continuous delivery pipeline the way we know it right now, but we have set up 3 different dev environments that are distributed in 3 different geographical regions. We have a QC environment here in New York. We have a UAT environment on the client side and production environment there. And we have built, using PowerShell scripts, a process that takes the code out of the repository, quickly creates an installation package. It communicates, it sends the installation package over SFTP from inside our premises to a point on the client side that is behind their firewall, and from there we have developed certain deployment agents that push the code and the new features to any type of UAT or prod minus an environment or a production environment. So that's what we did. It is a delivery pipeline. There is a continuous flow. Obviously, it breaks somewhere because you always have to deal with some firewall from a client. However, it's a delivery system, and it works much better than it was before. That added a lot of value. Now, for our cloud-based products, obviously there I can talk hours. I mean, everything is fully automated. I mean, we use all the latest technology and the technology tools to achieve continuous delivery, and that's great. But of course, the question is about legacy. So I believe even in legacy environments, if you look at any system and you separate what's good versus what is perhaps not that great, there are always ways to optimize and to automate and improve the value of the system. So that's what we do, and that's our standard practice these days in my company.
That's great. All right, Dimitris, thank you. Great closing comments from you as well. I'm going to give it to my colleague Anders to close us off. I'm going to hold the button down for you so that they can hear you.
I'm going to be really fast. I think I agree very heartily with this idea that handoffs are the killer. Anytime you've got manual handoffs, and I think one of the symptoms of manual handoffs is ticketing systems. I think ticketing systems are the most anti-agile thing there is. And by ticketing system, I mean where you submit something to be done so that somebody else can do it. In other words, fancy Post-it notes. So I think ticketing systems are the antichrist, and we should get rid of them.
Fantastic. And I love the comments about API-driven environments rather than virtualization.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good call from Dave and Uri. Folks, thank you all for joining. This was, we did not get to cover, really even scratch the surface of all the stuff that we could have talked about. You guys obviously are out there making this stuff happen every day. It's great that you're able to join us, from Anders, myself, and the rest of the team here at Continuous Discussion. Thank you for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.